We're going to talk about Plato this week, and we are going to continue our epistemology and metaphysics unit, finish it actually. And with our third thinker, we're kind of going backwards in history. We start with Hume, then go back to Aquinas, then back to Plato from that, which is something we don't normally do, but I thought it'd be more fun to do it this way. So, okay, so we've now looked at two very different approaches to the questions that really define this unit. What is really real, first, or metaphysics? And then how do we know it? And that's epistemology. Aquinas tried to answer both by, as we saw, tracing causal chains in the world back to a sort of necessary first cause. And he tried to use both experience and reason there. Hume pushed back hard on that kind of project, arguing that reason can't go as far as Aquinas wanted, particularly because of causation, and that our knowledge of reality is much more limited than the philosophical tradition assumed. Okay, so now we're going to look at a third approach, and this one's older than either Aquinas or Hume, and in some ways is more radical than the other three in terms of being extreme. Because Plato was writing around 380 BC, so we're talking about more than 2,000 years ago. But he doesn't just question how much we can know about reality, he questions whether the world as we experience it is really real at all. And that's going to be a weird thing. He's going to be telling a story about how to know what is fundamentally real, but also sort of saying at the same time that the world as we experience it may not be really real at all. Okay, so it's going to sound strange at first, but stick with it. It's one of the most influential ideas in the history of philosophy, and people will talk about this a lot. Even people who've never read Plato know this, this little story. That's why it's one reason why it's important to read. Even if people haven't read it in the official part of the Republic, they're aware of the allegory of the cave. So it's something that's good to know. And it's, once you understand what he's arguing, you start to see it in lots of other places too. You see it in Aquinas, in lots of religious thought, in certain ways of understanding science, and some versions of the mind-body problem we even looked at the very beginning. So it's something that will come up in many, many different ways. So let's talk about what the allegory of the cave is. It's a thought experiment, first of all. Okay, so it's different from what we've been reading because it's not really an argument in the traditional sense, right? Plato makes tons of arguments throughout his reading, and this comes from a book of his called The Republic, which was primarily about how to design and organize the best kind of political state. But in it, he talks a whole lot about how do we educate people, how do we get people who are good to rule, how do we organize society, all kinds of questions. And the book is just filled with arguments. They're dialogues between Socrates and a number of other people. But what he does here is Plato also liked to tell a lot of little stories. He would use allegories and he'd talk about myth a lot. And this is probably the most famous allegory or story with a purpose that he tells in the whole book. So, and it's really, like I said, it's a thought experiment because he wants you to recognize where this happens in other things that you're investigating in other parts of your life, in any other kind of situation you might find yourself in. So it's applicable not just to philosophy, but to all kinds of things. And it really is, as I say here, a thought experiment about reality, perception, and knowledge. Okay, so here's the basic outline. Okay, so imagine a group of people who had been chained inside an underground cave their whole life. Okay, their entire lives. They're fixed in place and they can only look at the wall in front of them. Okay, so they can't even really turn their heads. Don't make this realistic. It's not supposed to be realistic. Like, how did they get down there? Why can't they turn their heads? Don't worry about that. It's just a thought experiment. So they're fixed in place. They can only look at the wall in front of them. Behind them, there's a fire, a big sort of bonfire that's burning. And between the fire and the prison and the prisoners, who consider them prisoners if they're chained down there, people carry objects along a raised walkway. And I always think of these as like shadow puppets, is what I think, that they're holding these things up. And so the fire casts shadows of those objects onto the wall, right? And that's all the prisoners have ever seen is shadows. Okay, nothing but shadows. And one thing that's important to know is that these people are not stupid. Okay, these people who are chained here, they're not stupid. They're regular people, intelligent people. And they've even developed like a whole culture around the shadows because that's all that they see. So they name them, they study them, they like get better at predicting which ones are going to follow which and whatnot, and they honor the most skilled shadow readers. Those shadows on the wall really are their reality. Okay, the only reality they've ever known. So Plato asks, in that situation, what would happen if one of those people were freed? So if someone untied the chains and turned this person around and forced them to look at the fire. So at first, what would happen? Well, he says at first they'd be blinded and disoriented. You know, the fire would be painful. This person has never looked at something that bright before in their entire life. So, right, then they would probably, their first reaction would probably be that the shadows that they had seen in the wall were more real than this painful, awful fire thing that they're looking at. Right? Because those other shadows are more clear to them because they're the only things that they've ever seen their whole life. This fire just doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit into anything that they could imagine, really. But then imagine that somebody takes them and drags them up out of the cave entrance into the sunlight. And the disorientation there would be even more extreme, and they could barely see anything at all. They're totally stripped of their context, right? That they don't have a wall anymore to look at. They have nothing. They can turn their head. They can move around. They've never been able to do it. It would just be, in many ways, so mind-blowing that they wouldn't really be able at first to see anything at all, because they just have literally no context for whatever it is. But gradually, the freed prisoner's eyes would start to adjust, and probably the first thing that they would see is shadows in the sunlight, right? Then they might see reflections in water. Then they might start to actually accept that real objects maybe are more real than the shadows. They'd see the sky at night, and finally, after a long adjustment, they could, you know, sort of, hopefully not for very long, but look at the sun itself and understand it for what it is, the source of all light, all the seasons, all growth, everything visible in the world above. And at that point, Plato says, this person would understand something that the prisoners below never could, that there's no way that they could experience that. The shadows in the cave were images of images, he says. Not reality at all, but those shadows are like a reflection of a reflection, sort of twice removed from what's really real, right? Because first of all, they're just cutouts. They're like shadow puppets. But then also, these people didn't even see the puppets themselves. They just see a shadow of them. So then comes kind of the darkest part of the thought experiment. Like, imagine then that this person is sent back into the cave, and their eyes at first adjusted to being out in the sun. They won't be able to see in the darkness, and they'll stumble around, and they won't be able to compete with the skilled shadow readers. And they're gonna actually, to all the people that they used to be chained up with, they're gonna sound absolutely ridiculous. They're gonna sound like a madman, because he's trying to tell them about things that they have no context for experiencing, right? And all the others are going to do is just mock him, right? And what would happen, he says, is if they persist in trying to free the others would probably kill him, because they'd assume that he's a madman who's just making them seem crazy. And so Plato adds a note at the end that he really intends us to recognize. And he says this is what happens to philosophers he mentions it in political life, but he kind of means in any aspect of life. That he says the philosopher who has genuinely understood reality returns to ordinary human affairs and sort of looks incompetent by the standards that everybody else uses. And, you know, first of all, Plato is there probably thinking of his teacher Socrates, who was put to death in Athens for exactly that kind of disruption, that they thought that Socrates was just teaching all these people heresies and these awful things, when all Socrates was doing was asking questions, and just trying to get people to see what's behind their regular opinions. So that's the basic allegory. Okay, that's the rundown. Sorry to spoil it for you, but that's kind of what it means. And Plato actually, I should have I'm always one slide behind. But this is that freed prisoner is going to have this really painful journey where it's going to be hard for him to learn the new things, and then when he goes back inside, it's going to be even harder for him to first readapt, and then also to get anyone to believe him or listen to him. So what is then the meaning? An allegory is always a story with a meaning, with a point. And Plato gives us the interpretation himself at the end of the passage. And he says that the cave is ordinary human experience. Here, let me go back one here. That the cave is really ordinary human experience. That the world as we perceive it through our senses, day to day, the regular world, the world that Hume was actually talking about it, that's the cave. Okay, so the shadows on the wall, he says, are the appearances of things in the world. So what we see, we hear, we touch, the changing and shifting surface of these things, right? The objects that cast the shadows, he thinks, are something closer to reality, just like those shadow puppets were closer to the real thing, like real people up outside of the cave. But they're still not the full picture. And then the sun, which illuminates everything and makes vision possible at all, is what Plato calls the form of the good, or the highest reality, the sort of source of all truth and being. But it's something that down in the cave, those people couldn't even comprehend or imagine, right? And the reason he's doing this, first of all, let me give you a little bit of background on Plato in general. Because this maps onto a distinction Plato makes throughout his entire philosophy between two different realms. Okay, he calls one the realm of becoming, and this is the ordinary physical world, where everything in it is always changing, growing, decaying, transforming. You know, like a beautiful face grows old, or, you know, a just law gets repealed, or a mathematical triangle that you draw on paper is never quite perfect, right? The physical world, he says, is always somehow in flux. It's always, things are always growing and changing and dying and imperfect, but it's always changing. It's never perfect. And what he's going to try and say is the things that are more real are the more perfect things. So where do we find that? And in that's where we get the realm of being. And so this is the world of what Plato calls the forms. The word for that in Greek is the id, or the idea, or the idea is how we pronounce it usually. But the common way that people talk about it in English are the forms. But the form of something, what a form is like the pure perfect idea of something. Okay, the form of a circle, for example, it's not like a particular circle drawn in chalk. It's the eternal, sort of unchanging, perfect pattern that all particular circles imperfectly somehow reflect. Okay, and so that's an example. We use the circle example. We'll do a couple others, but like the forms themselves, they never change. They're not physical at all. And they're not located in space and time. They just are what they are, always perfect, complete, and perfect in themselves. And he does kind of consider this a totally different realm of being. And it's a realm that your mind has access to, but that is not physical. Okay, so we get a little bit of a mind-body split here. But really, you're going to see the world of the forms is so perfect. It's not just the idea in your head. It's actually, he thinks, has to be truly existing somewhere. Okay, so here's another way to think about what a form is for Plato. It's because of a form that you can sort of recognize anything at all. Okay, so let's take a chair, like this chair I'm sitting on right here. You know, sitting on an office chair, it's the kind that spins and it has wheels and whatnot. But how do I know that this thing is a chair? Right? It's different from any other chair that I've seen. It doesn't have four legs. I mean, it does have kind of a cushy thing from your butt. You know, but this chair, it looks totally different. So how can I look at all these different things that are different chairs, but recognize that they all are a chair? How can I see that they are that thing? And Plato says that it's because ultimately we somehow have access to the idea or the form of a chair in our head. It's like the deepest essential definition of chairness. So there's sort of like a platonic form or a perfect form of a chair. And whenever we recognize a chair, whenever we look at a particular chair, our mind recognizes that it's like a reflection of the perfect form of a chair. Okay. Same goes for anything else. Any real existing thing like this chair, might be seen as being somehow imperfect, right? I mean, this chair doesn't have four legs, but I still know it's a chair. Even if it was kind of broken, I could still tell what it was for, and I could tell that it was supposed to be a chair. And Plato says that we can only recognize things like that because there has to exist some pure, perfect form of the thing that exists only in a kind of intellectual space or realm. Okay, so numbers are another perfect example. Think of the number 3. Do you ever, in the physical world, see 3? The actual 3. The 3 that lies behind every other 3, right? No, you always see 3 things, like I got a pen and a screwdriver and a pair of glasses, right? You can see 3 things, but that doesn't mean that I actually see the number 3 right here. No, I see these 3 particular things. But Plato says in order to recognize that as 3, we've got to have access to the pure idea of 3 that we can sort of apply to those 3 things and see that those are kind of a reflection of that more perfect idea. Okay. Same thing like with the shape, any shape, like a circle. So in the real world, you probably never see a perfect circle, right? Even in the most carefully drawn circle, even in computer drawings and whatnot, you probably never seen a perfect circle, right? Where every little point is exactly the same distance from the center as every other point. But, we can still recognize the idea of a pure circle and recognize when real circles all around us are supposed to be circles, even if they're not perfect. And that's because the form of a circle, Plato says, would be a perfect circle. It's the purest sort of essence of circleness. And for Plato, that world of forms is what is really real, because those sort of intellectual things are the perfect versions of themselves. They're perfect, they're complete, they're not sort of limited by anything. Because any actually physically existing thing is going to be imperfect in some way or another. If nothing else, just because it's capable of falling apart. That if something came into existence, it can go out of existence again. But Plato is going to suggest that makes it kind of imperfect. A perfect thing wouldn't be subject to time. It would just exist constantly imperfectly. So the real circle would have to be like that. So yeah, the forms are more real than the physical world. The form of a circle is more real than any chalk circle you could draw. And this sounds really backwards to modern ears, right? Because we tend to think that physical things are the really real things, and that abstractions, like ideas, are somehow less real. We always kind of say those are just in our heads. For Plato, though, the things that are in our heads are more perfect and therefore more real. Okay, and Plato's got a reason for this view, and that's because what's always changing, always imperfect, always dependent on something else for its qualities. That's another thing he would want to say, is that in order for us to recognize this chair as a chair, it depends on the idea of a pure chair. That we couldn't get chair just from this chair by itself. We have to have access to the idea or the form of a chair somehow. So just to repeat what I was going to say, the reason that Plato says that the forms are more real is that what's always changing, always imperfect, always dependent on something else is less real than what's eternal, perfect, and self-subsistent. And by that standard, the forms, they win. They're what's really real. So let me kind of say Plato's answers to the 2 central questions of the unit as clearly as I can about metaphysics and epistemology. So on the metaphysical question, what's really real, Plato says, are the forms. That the physical world we experience is real in some sense, but it's real the way a shadow is real. So it has some existence, but it's derivative, imperfect, always changing, always dependent on something else. right? Like think about those shadows in the cave. They depended on being sort of a reflection of the real thing, right? Or a resemblance to the real thing, but they weren't the thing themselves, right? Um, and so uh, physical things, Plato says, have some existence, but it's always imperfect, always changing, always dependent. And so the deepest level of reality really is whatever's going to be unchanging, that eternal world of forms that sort of underlies and makes possible the physical world, he says. That's his answer to the metaphysical question. On the epistemological question, or how do we know that, Plato's answer is almost the exact opposite of Hume's. Okay, Hume said we only learn through experience, right? Only through what the senses deliver. Plato says the opposite. We only ever know things through reason, only by turning away from the senses. Maybe we start with the senses, but it's only when we turn away from the senses and look for the pure ideas behind things, the forms, that's the only time that we actually start to know what's really real. Okay, so what he says is that the senses deliver a kind of opinion about the changing world of appearances, but the senses can't give you knowledge of the forms, right? Because the forms are not physical and they can't be seen or touched. Only things you can see or touch, Plato's going to say, are sort of imperfect things. But it's only the intellect, your mind, when it's trained and disciplined, especially through philosophical education, he would say, can grasp what's really real. Okay, and this is probably the sharpest contrast in the whole unit, that Hume says, trust your senses, be skeptical of reason and its ability to go beyond them. Because Hume has a lot of reasons for saying you can't necessarily trust induction, right? Because there might also always be a little different tomorrow. But Plato says the opposite way. Plato says distrust your senses because they just give you shadows. They give you imperfect things. Only reason, which is where you can get access to the pure three or the pure circle, because you can think about the essence or the definition or the pure idea of those things. Only reason can reach reality. So, two really famous philosophers, 2,000 years apart, with almost exactly opposite epistemologies. Okay, so, all right. So there's a whole lot more to say about Plato, and we've gone over him really quickly there. But I wanted to bring him up and let you have a chance to read the Allegory of the Cave, because it's so influential. Also, it does serve as a nice contrast to Hume. So with that said, let's talk about comparisons between these three briefly here, because I think this will help just a little bit for you to understand a little bit more about these. So first, Plato and Aquinas, they're both what you can call realist metaphysicians. Okay, so they both believe that there's a deeper level of reality behind the world of everyday experience. And they both think that reason has access to that. So Aquinas' sense of God and Plato's forms, they're doing similar philosophical work in lots of ways. Both both God and the forms are sort of the ultimate source of all truth and all goodness and all reality. So everything else, they think, derives its existence and its qualities from that source, right? Plato talks about reflections of things. Aquinas sort of feels the same way, that real things are somehow reflections of the more real things. Trying to find, I have notes here that don't make sense. Yeah, skipping that. So, but there are important differences between Plato and Aquinas too. So Aquinas gets to God by tracing causal chains in the physical world, right? He thought about how things work in the physical world and said there must be like a first start to it. He starts from experience and moves upward through influence. And Aquinas does take the world, the physical world, seriously as a starting point. But Plato, by contrast, he thinks that the physical world is fundamentally misleading and that you really do have to turn away from just the physical world and the senses in order to actually have access to what's really real. So Plato is going to say, don't pay attention to your senses. Don't think about them carefully. Turn away from them and just think about what's purely intellectual, because that's what's really real. Right? So you reach reality, Plato says, by turning away from the physical stuff around you to think about the things that are truly, perfectly real, which are intellectual things. Okay. So Hume then is the skeptic who challenges both of them. So against Aquinas, Hume argued that our causal reasoning can't establish any sort of necessary unified reality like Aquinas wants, and we talked about that. Against Plato, Hume would say something probably even more fundamental. He'd say that the forms themselves are exactly the kind of thing that Hume's fork, his test, would eliminate. Right? He'd ask, what impression gave rise to the idea of the form of the good, say something you've never seen, never heard, never touched. And by Hume's criteria, the idea of a form is something being eternal and perfectly real. That's precisely the kind of abstraction that may be nothing more than just a word, right? Just an idea with no corresponding impression in the world and therefore no real genuine content, just like a cause. Right? Hume says that causes are things we never actually experience or see. We just see this thing happens, then that thing happens over and over and over and over again, and then call that a cause. But we never actually experience a cause directly. So now that's not really a refutation of Plato, though. And Plato actually anticipated something like this objection. And his answer would be that the capacity for knowing the forms is already in us. I mean, we can do math. Right? We can do math without constantly seeing the physical things in front of us, right? That's a perfect example. Logic would be another example, Plato says, that you can do math or logic with no reference to actual physical things, and you can reach truth that way. So the question of whether there's any genuine route from the human mind to eternal truth in one way, it's one of the oldest things. It goes back to Plato, who is really probably in many ways the first philosopher to write down real arguments. Socrates may have been the first philosopher to make arguments like that. Socrates didn't write anything down. We only know about Socrates through Plato and another guy named Xenophon, but that's okay. So that's really the big set of differences between the three. And one thing I want to point out then too, I'm one behind here, but yeah, just real quickly, the sharpest contrast, the biggest difference between these three guys is Hume and Plato. And you can probably see, too, where the next place I'm going to go is how Hume, again, is the philosopher of the many, and Plato is going to be the most extreme sort of philosopher of the one that we're going to talk about in just a second. And actually, let's do that. And I'm going to give you the slides because I got my slides a little out of order here. So let's talk about the one and the many, though, for right now. So as I said, Plato's the most committed one thinker we've read all semester. And I want to explain exactly how that is. So for him, the physical world, or that world of becoming, like he said, that's the many, the world of the many. It's endlessly sort of plural, always changing. It's different for every observer. It's never the same thing from one moment to the next. So there's no stable unity in the physical world, Plato thinks. So every beautiful thing we find eventually becomes ugly. You know, every good arrangement that you find eventually kind of falls apart, and like no two people maybe even see the exact same color when they look at the sky. We don't really know. The forms, though, when you put them all together, they're the one. They're eternal. They're perfectly unified in themselves. They're the same for everyone who grasps them. When you think about the number 3, that's the same 3 as everybody else. That's why math works no matter who you are, right? Because it's always the same thing. The forms are also, they're like the and part of the reason he talks about the form of the good is Plato tries to say that the form of the good is like, in his mind, that's essentially God, that it's sort of like the uber form, the best and biggest form is the form of the good itself. It's sort of like a single ultimate unity that gives everything else its reality. Okay, so that's what the sun is in the allegory. So this is a much stronger version of the one and the many distinction than what we saw with Aquinas. Aquinas, he wanted a necessary first cause, a necessary being, one God, but Aquinas didn't deny the reality of the physical world, right? He started from it. He said it was there. For Plato, though, the physical world is more like just kind of an image or a reflection of the real things. It's sort of like a bad copy or a shadow Like this world that we're in right now, Plato thought that's the shadow of the forms. So we really are, in his mind, literally living in a kind of cave. It's just more of an intellectual cave than a physical one. So the one for Plato isn't just the cause of the many, like it might be for Aquinas. It's more real than the many. So, and Hume, as always, he's the philosopher who refuses to let us rest in the comfortable idea of that kind of unified or rational reality behind appearances, right? His many is truly many. He just thinks that experience and even knowledge is always many. It's sequences of experiences, one after the other. There's no necessary unity behind them. There's no forms. There's no God of any kind of Platonic kind in Hume. That whatever unity we find for Hume, we bring to experience ourselves. In other words, it's something we project onto our experience, but it's not actually there in the world itself. Okay. So that's really the three-way kind of conversation where this unit's been heading. So these guys are three of the greatest philosophers in Western history. They each give different answers to the same two questions of what's really real. How do we know it? I hope that sitting with all three has given you a little more to think about, and given you some different ways of looking at the problems. And one thing I want you to do, and this is what your discussion board for this week is about, is to sit with Plato and think about where you can find some kind of cave situation in your own life. Okay, so I've decided I want to make this one just be a little bit more personal because, like I said, the allegory of the cave is applicable in many different areas and aspects. So I want you to try and think of something a little about your experience or your specialty. It doesn't have to be super deep, but just about some situation where the more you learn about something, the more the reality of that situation looks totally different from what you thought it was at first. Okay, and then what happens when you try to go back to either talk about people who didn't go through the same experiences you did, or talk to people who haven't learned the same things you have? What's that experience like? It's not comfortable. But that's what I want you to think about this week: is how can the allegory of the cave be applicable to other aspects of our lives? So last summary I can give you, the whole unit in sort of three questions, or three statements. Aquinas says reason can demonstrate what's most real, and it turns out to be God, the necessary being behind all contingent existence. Hume says our knowledge is limited to what experience delivers alone. Reason can't establish the necessity or unity that Aquinas and Plato want. And then Plato says that the world that we experience is just like a shadow, and it's only reason, discipline through philosophy or lots and lots of logic training, only then can you reach what's really real, says Plato. So three very different approaches. We're getting abstract, but like I said a couple times, metaphysics is really the most abstract of all the areas of philosophy. So this one does get very abstract. If you have questions, or if you feel like there's any one of the three particular philosophers you just haven't got a good grasp on this time, let me know. I'd be happy to talk about it or go over anything that you want to. Otherwise, I will look forward to reading your discussion board this week, and the information on the test will be there soon. Okay. Take care, guys.